The world thought it knew Meghan Markle. The world thought it had seen it all. The glamorous entrances, the Hollywood smiles, the headlines, the interviews, the carefully staged public appearances. But what if everything we've believed about Meghan, about the royal family, and even about Archie and Lilibet was a carefully orchestrated illusion? What if beneath the layers of sequins, charity galas, and Instagram-perfect moments, there lay secrets so explosive that they could shake the monarchy to its very foundations? What if the very children who were celebrated as heirs, symbols of a modernizing royal family, carried within them a story the public was never meant to hear? But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. The first whispers of suspicion began quietly, barely audible over the fanfare of royal weddings, baby showers, and press conferences. At first, they were dismissed as conspiracy theories, the kind of rumors that swirl endlessly around high-profile families. But intelligence agencies, the very ones tasked with protecting national security and monitoring high-stakes risks, began paying attention. M6, the secretive British intelligence service, a name almost mythical in its shadowed operations, began to investigate. And when M6 investigates, even the most carefully curated public narratives can crumble like old parchment under fire. Why would M6, the agency shrouded in mystery, even consider looking into the private lives of the Duke and Duchess of Sussex? The answer, as it would later emerge, lay in the very records that most people never think about: birth records. Official documents that, on their surface, are mundane. But in these pages, these dry bureaucratic statements, lay hints of discrepancies, anomalies that were impossible to ignore. And when those hints were followed, traced, and scrutinized, they revealed a truth so shocking that even the most seasoned palace aides were left speechless. Imagine for a moment the scene inside a private palace residence. Meghan Markle, accustomed to navigating public scrutiny with a polished composure, was suddenly confronted with information she could not control. The news did not leak via tabloid journalists or social media threads. It came from a source she could neither influence nor silence. And the effect was immediate: panic. A surge of fear that gripped her in ways no headline could capture. It was the kind of fear that makes you question every decision, every public statement, every smile you have ever given. But what had triggered it? What was so dangerous, so volatile, that even someone as composed and media-savvy as Meghan Markle found herself rattled? The answer lies in the birth records of her children, Archie and Lilibet. According to sources who have requested anonymity, but whose credibility is unimpeachable within intelligence circles, the investigation uncovered inconsistencies, details that did not match the public narrative. Names, dates, medical information, signatures. Each anomaly by itself could be dismissed as clerical error, but when combined, they painted a picture that challenged long-held assumptions about maternity, family legitimacy, and the very public image that Meghan and Harry had spent years constructing. It is not just the revelations themselves that make this story extraordinary. It is the implications. The British royal family, one of the oldest and most meticulously documented institutions in the world, is built upon layers of precedent, lineage, and ceremonial authority. The notion that birth records could hold secrets capable of undermining public trust, or at the very least sparking international intrigue, is staggering. And yet, as M6 began piecing together the puzzle, the picture that emerged was undeniable. There was something deeply unusual about Archie and Lilibet's records. Something that raised a question that no one was willing to ask out loud. Could it be possible that Meghan Markle was not the biological mother of her own children? Pause for a moment and let that sink in. The very idea challenges everything we think we know about parenthood, identity, and the public persona that Meghan has cultivated for years. How could such a secret remain hidden in an age of endless surveillance, paparazzi, and digital footprints? And perhaps most importantly, what would happen if this information became public? The answer is simple: chaos. Public backlash, media frenzy, palace turmoil, and a global conversation about the nature of truth, motherhood, and celebrity power. From the very first days of the investigation, insiders say, the palace was acutely aware of the stakes. Meetings were convened behind closed doors. Legal teams were mobilized. Communication strategies were drafted. Every move was calculated, every word measured, because in the world of the royals, even a hint of scandal can ripple across continents. And for Meghan, the pressure was unprecedented. No longer just a duchess navigating media criticism, she was now at the center of a storm that could redefine her life, her family, and her legacy. Yet, the story is not as simple as secrets, lies, and deception. There are layers upon layers of complexity. Consider the intense scrutiny Meghan has faced since the beginning. Media narratives that painted her in conflicting lights, public adulation and criticism in equal measure, and personal challenges that were magnified under the glare of global attention. Add to that the extraordinary level of secrecy maintained by M16, and it becomes clear why even small revelations in the investigation could carry enormous weight. Each detail, each document, each cross-checked fact had the potential to ignite a media wildfire and push the royal family into uncharted territory. And what about Harry? For him, the stakes were both personal and public. A son, a father, and a royal heir, he had built his identity around loyalty, love, and protecting his family. But now, that protective instinct was pitted against an unrelenting tide of scrutiny, questions that could not be answered publicly without sparking even greater controversy. Observers note that in private moments, Harry's usual composure gave way to visible tension. It was a kind of fear familiar to anyone who has faced a situation where personal and public lives collide, where every move is watched, every word analyzed, and every reaction can have monumental consequences. Meanwhile, the public remained largely unaware. Headlines continued to report on mundane royal events, charity initiatives, public appearances, vacations. But behind the scenes, the machinery of secrecy was in full motion. Legal counsel, intelligence analysts, palace aides, and security officers worked to contain the narrative, prevent leaks, and anticipate the fallout. For Meghan, the pressure was intensifying, and panic, sources suggest, became an ever-present companion. It was a different kind of visibility, one where the stakes were measured not in public approval, but in truth, legacy, and the delicate balance of power within a centuries-old institution. What makes this story so compelling, so almost unbelievable, is that it unfolds at the intersection of personal identity and public image. How do you reconcile the truth of who someone is with the narrative the world expects to see? How do you navigate a situation where even family and close allies may not have the full picture? And most importantly, how do you survive when intelligence agencies are involved, documents are scrutinized, and the public is waiting for answers that may never fully come? This is not a story of simple scandal. It is a story of secrets, scrutiny, and the fragile veneer of perfection that surrounds public figures. It is a story about fear, panic, and the very human instinct to protect one's family, one's image, and one's legacy. And as the investigation continued, as documents were examined, as anomalies were traced and verified, the picture became clearer and more alarming. Every layer peeled back revealed new questions, contradictions, and emotional complexities that threatened to upend everything the world thought it knew. And yet, even as all of this was unfolding, Meghan maintained her public composure. She smiled for cameras, waved at crowds, attended events, and spoke in carefully prepared statements. But insiders insist that behind that composed exterior lay a maelstrom of anxiety. Every press article, every social media post, every whispered rumor felt like a countdown clock, each tick bringing the potential for exposure, confrontation, and irreversible consequences. The human mind, even under intense training and experience, struggles under such weight. And for someone living life under a microscope, the pressure could only grow. So why does this matter now? Why, after years of speculation, controversy, and intense media focus, is this revelation so significant? Because the documents in question, the birth records, were never meant for public eyes. They were part of a quiet, bureaucratic system, a mechanism of record-keeping that normally operates unseen. And yet, through careful scrutiny, intelligence work, and investigative persistence, the truth began to emerge. What it revealed was a story not just of public image, but of identity, parentage, and the hidden machinations that shaped the lives of even the most famous among us. And what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The investigation had reached a turning point. Files that were once just names and dates suddenly became explosive evidence. Analysts within M6, after weeks of cross-referencing, verified what had been only speculation. Anomalies existed that demanded explanation. Questions multiplied. Why had these discrepancies persisted? Who was responsible for any concealment, if indeed there was one? And most provocatively, could it be true that Meghan Markle, as the world knows her, was not the biological mother of Archie and Lilibet? Every royal family has secrets. Every family, no matter how public, carries truths that are whispered rather than spoken aloud. But rarely do those secrets collide with the public narrative so violently. And as the investigation deepened, it became evident that this was not just a minor scandal. This was a revelation with consequences that extended beyond tabloids and social media. It was a story that would force the monarchy to confront uncomfortable realities, force the public to question what they had accepted as fact, and force Meghan and Harry to navigate a storm of unprecedented proportions. So, as we begin this story, keep this in mind. What you are about to hear, read, and consider is more than a simple exposé. It is a journey into the hidden corridors of power, secrecy, and family. It is a tale of panic, investigation, and the extraordinary measures people will take to protect what they hold most dear. And as each chapter unfolds, you will see how every twist, every revelation, and every emotional spike brings us closer to a truth that is stranger, darker, and more complex than anyone could have imagined. And now, the question lingers. When the dust settles, what will remain of Meghan Markle's public image, her family, and the carefully constructed narrative of her life? The answers lie in the pages ahead, and the first revelations are closer than you think. From the outside, Meghan Markle's life seemed almost cinematic. Born into relative privilege in Los Angeles, she navigated the world of Hollywood with determination, charm, and a carefully cultivated public image. Audiences knew her as an actress, a voice for humanitarian causes, and a modern, confident woman making her mark on the world. But behind the camera, behind the interviews, behind the perfectly lit photo shoots, a different story was quietly taking shape. One that no one, not even her closest allies, fully understood at the time. Imagine a young Meghan, navigating her early career, balancing ambition with societal expectations, and forging relationships in an industry notorious for both glamour and scrutiny. Her public persona was meticulously polished, eloquent, socially aware, and composed under pressure. She built a life around the idea of control over her career, her image, and the narrative that surrounded her. Yet, as with all carefully controlled stories, the first hints of disruption were subtle, almost imperceptible. It wasn't until Meghan's relationship with Prince Harry began to gain attention that the first cracks started to show. The public was enchanted by the fairy tale narrative. A Hollywood actress meets a British prince, sparks fly, romance blooms across continents. Headlines celebrated their courtship, and social media buzzed with speculation, admiration, and excitement. But those closest to the couple noticed small tensions. The intense media attention was not just relentless. It was invasive, scrutinizing every gesture, every smile, every public statement. Meghan, trained to navigate Hollywood's demanding spotlight, found herself under a microscope unlike anything she had ever encountered. There were moments when the pressure became almost unbearable. Staff would later recount instances where Meghan retreated from public appearances to process the relentless scrutiny. The stories paint a picture of a woman who, while outwardly composed, experienced significant emotional strain. The palace environment, with its centuries-old traditions and strict protocols, was a world entirely foreign to someone accustomed to the relatively open and flexible structures of Hollywood. It was a delicate balancing act, adapting to royal life while maintaining the persona she had meticulously crafted for years. And yet, despite these challenges, Meghan pressed forward. She embraced charity work, delivered speeches, and engaged with the public with a practiced grace. But beneath the veneer of composure, anxiety simmered. It was the anxiety of someone who understood that every misstep, however minor, could be amplified into a global scandal. Every casual remark, every photograph, every social media post had the potential to be dissected, analyzed, and weaponized by critics and the press. During these early months, Meghan's life was marked by dualities. Publicly, she was poised, charming, and philanthropic. Privately, she was alert, strategic, and cautious, aware that one wrong move could set off a chain reaction that would reverberate far beyond her immediate circle. Friends and aides noticed a growing tension, a sense that Meghan was constantly preparing for contingencies that no one else could anticipate. It was a life lived in anticipation of crisis, and for someone unaccustomed to such scrutiny, it was exhausting. Harry, for his part, played a unique role in this dynamic. He understood the pressures of royal life, having grown up under the glare of global attention. Yet even he could not fully shield Meghan from the weight of expectations. Observers noted that he tried to provide support, but the challenges were relentless. Each public appearance became a careful choreography, each media interaction a potential minefield. The tension between maintaining royal protocol and protecting personal well-being became increasingly pronounced, foreshadowing the turbulence that was to come. Meanwhile, outside the immediate palace circle, the media ecosystem thrived. Every move Meghan made was scrutinized. Every appearance sparked commentary, speculation, and sometimes outright hostility. Headlines oscillated between praise and criticism, often within the span of a single news cycle. Social media amplified both support and skepticism, creating a feedback loop that intensified the pressure. It was an environment where rumors could metastasize into perceived truths, and where small inconsistencies could be exaggerated into monumental controversies. It was within this environment of intense scrutiny and high stakes that the earliest whispers of more profound challenges began to emerge. At first, they were almost imperceptible: minor discrepancies, unexplained delays, subtle tensions in official communications. But for those trained to notice patterns, palace staff, legal advisors, and eventually intelligence analysts, these small irregularities were the first signs of a story that was far larger than anyone had anticipated. What made this period particularly significant was the juxtaposition of calm and tension. On the surface, Meghan's life appeared controlled, orderly, and glamorous. Beneath that surface, however, subtle currents of uncertainty began to flow. There was a growing awareness, however faint, that the story being told to the public might not fully capture the reality behind palace doors. And while Meghan herself may not have anticipated the full extent of what was coming, the first tremors of disruption were already shaking the foundations of her carefully constructed life. By the time the couple married, these tensions had intensified. The wedding itself was a global spectacle, a moment of unprecedented attention and admiration. Millions watched, millions speculated, and millions formed opinions, all within moments. And yet, even amid the celebration, those closest to Meghan could sense undercurrents of unease. There were subtle signs that the pressures of public life, combined with the hidden complexities of royal protocol, were beginning to weigh heavily on her psyche. It was during this calm before the storm that the foundation for the later revelations was laid. The early months and years of Meghan's royal life contained clues, small, often overlooked details, that, when viewed retrospectively, foreshadowed the panic, scrutiny, and investigation that would eventually engulf her. The meticulous attention to image, the strategic planning of public appearances, and the careful management of information were all necessary adaptations to an environment that valued perception above all else. And yet, no amount of preparation could fully insulate Meghan from what was about to happen. The investigation into birth records, the scrutiny of documents, and the involvement of intelligence agencies would introduce pressures that even her experience could not fully mitigate. The calm, composed exterior she maintained for the public was a fragile veneer, one that would soon be tested in ways no one could have predicted. So as we trace this story from its earliest stages, it's important to recognize the dual realities at play. The life presented to the public, polished and controlled, and the private life, fraught with anticipation, anxiety, and subtle warning signs. This duality is essential to understanding the unfolding drama. It is within this tension, this contrast between image and reality, that the seeds of panic, investigation, and revelation were sown. And just when it seemed that Meghan had navigated these early challenges successfully, the first real shocks of the investigation began to ripple through the palace. What appeared at first to be minor irregularities would soon escalate into a full-blown inquiry, and the calm that had defined her early royal life would give way to a level of scrutiny and fear unlike anything she had previously encountered. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Stepping into the world of the British monarchy is not like stepping onto a new stage. It is stepping into a different universe entirely. The rules are invisible until you break them. The consequences are magnified by centuries of tradition, and the public's gaze is relentless, unblinking, and unforgiving. For Meghan Markle, the transition from Hollywood actress to Duchess of Sussex was more than a change of address. It was a seismic shift in every aspect of life, identity, and expectation. The first time Meghan entered this world officially, the cameras caught only the surface. Smiles, waves, a carefully choreographed grace, and the polished ritual of engagement announcements. But behind the scenes, she was entering a world built on invisible codes, subtle hierarchies, and traditions so deeply entrenched that breaking them, even unintentionally, could provoke scandal. To outsiders, it might have seemed like an extension of her previous public life. Attending galas, being photographed, engaging in public diplomacy, but the stakes were fundamentally different. Every move was symbolic, every gesture weighed, and every word could become a headline. The palace, in all its grandeur, is a world unto itself. Staff operate like a highly efficient machine, balancing protocol with discretion. Advisors and aides are both mentors and monitors, guiding newcomers while quietly testing their ability to adapt. For Meghan, it was an environment both fascinating and intimidating. She had experience navigating Hollywood's social dynamics, but royal life demanded more than charm and intelligence. It demanded an almost preternatural ability to anticipate repercussions, navigate politics, and manage perception with precision. Missteps were not merely embarrassing. They were potentially historic, recorded and dissected by generations of historians, biographers, and relentless media scrutiny. Even in these early days, subtle cultural clashes became apparent. Meghan's American upbringing, marked by a more open, informal approach to public life, sometimes collided with the rigid structure of British royalty. Social interactions that seemed polite and natural to her were interpreted through a lens of centuries-old protocol. Timing, posture, tone, all were scrutinized in ways she had never encountered. It was a daily exercise in vigilance, one that required constant recalibration of behavior, awareness, and strategy. At the same time, the media played its dual role, simultaneously her amplifier and her adversary. Meghan's every action was covered with obsessive detail. Positive headlines celebrated her modernizing influence. Negative ones criticized perceived missteps. Social media amplified praise and criticism in equal measure, creating an almost constant feedback loop that influenced public perception and, in turn, palace strategy. Every day presented the risk that a casual gesture could be misinterpreted, a minor comment could escalate into a scandal, and a carefully managed image could unravel in a matter of hours. Prince Harry, aware of these pressures, became both guide and protector. His own life had been shaped under the relentless glare of public attention, and he understood the unique psychological toll it could take. Yet, even he could not fully shield Meghan from the intricacies of palace life. Differences in upbringing, experience, and public perception meant that while he navigated these pressures with familiarity, she was still learning the rules, often in real time. Their partnership was tested continuously, balancing love and loyalty with the practical demands of an institution that prioritized tradition above all else. One of the most challenging aspects of integration was the subtle but powerful network of palace relationships. Alliances, informal hierarchies, and historical tensions dictated access, influence, and perception. Meghan, as an outsider, had to navigate these relationships carefully. A misread comment or poorly timed initiative could ripple across the institution, affecting not only her public standing but also the couple's influence within the royal family. The process was not malicious in intent, but the stakes were high, and the margin for error was minuscule. Simultaneously, Meghan's public persona had to adapt. Media appearances, charitable engagements, and official duties demanded a consistent image of dignity, empathy, and sophistication. Yet, the reality of private pressures often contrasted starkly with the polished public image. Hours of preparation went into speeches, visits, and even casual appearances, with teams crafting messaging designed to reinforce both personal authenticity and institutional expectations. Despite these efforts, leaks, rumors, and social media commentary often undermined them, heightening anxiety and feeding the sense of vulnerability that was becoming increasingly difficult to manage. These pressures were magnified by the intense global interest in Meghan and Harry as a couple. Every trip, every gesture, every word was scrutinized not only by British citizens, but by audiences worldwide. Fans, critics, and casual observers alike engaged in endless speculation, creating a perpetual cycle of visibility and judgment. For Meghan, this was both an opportunity and a trap, a platform to make a difference and a stage that magnified the consequences of any misstep. The balance between authenticity and survival became a daily negotiation. Yet, amid these pressures, Meghan demonstrated remarkable adaptability. She quickly learned to navigate formal events, diplomatic engagements, and media interactions with a growing sense of strategy and awareness. Observers noted that she developed a keen understanding of palace dynamics, anticipating potential friction points and adjusting her approach accordingly. However, this growing mastery came with its own cost. Emotional exhaustion, heightened self-awareness, and the constant need to monitor every interaction for unintended consequences. The juxtaposition of public adoration and private tension defined much of Meghan's early years in the royal family. While media narratives celebrated her modernity and philanthropic initiatives, the reality behind palace walls was one of constant vigilance and negotiation. Friends and aides described moments of isolation, when the weight of expectation seemed almost unbearable. Even as she presented calm and composure to the public, the private reality was a world of calculated strategy, anticipatory stress, and the relentless pressure to conform to an institution that was as unforgiving as it was venerable. This tension laid the groundwork for the crisis to come. Subtle inconsistencies, small misunderstandings, and early signs of strain became indicators of the vulnerability that would later be exploited by external pressures. As Meghan settled into her role, she was simultaneously learning the intricacies of palace life and unknowingly stepping into a situation where her private life would soon intersect with public scrutiny in unprecedented ways. The calm of her early integration was deceptive. The protocols, the public admiration, and the initial successes masked the vulnerability that would soon become central to the narrative. As she built relationships, learned the rules, and began establishing her influence, the first hints of disruption, the anomalies, the whispers, the subtle misalignments, were quietly emerging. These were the seeds of the storm that would eventually engulf her personal and public life, setting the stage for panic, investigation, and controversy. And just as Meghan was becoming more comfortable in her royal identity, the first cracks in the carefully constructed narrative began to show. The world still saw a poised, modern duchess, but behind the scenes, forces were gathering, forces that would eventually challenge everything she had worked to establish. But what came next would test not only her adaptability, but the very foundations of the story that the world thought it knew about Meghan Markle. The arrival of children is usually a moment of profound joy, an occasion where the world pauses to witness life's most intimate miracles. For Meghan Markle and Prince Harry, the births of Archie and later Lilibet were no different in emotional significance. Yet they were also events of unprecedented public attention, media scrutiny, and, ultimately, the beginnings of an extraordinary controversy that would engulf the couple. What should have been a private celebration became a spectacle on a global stage, with every detail dissected, every gesture analyzed, and every announcement amplified to reach millions. Archie's birth, announced in May 2019, was framed as a joyful milestone, the couple's first child and a symbol of a modernizing monarchy. The public narrative was carefully managed. Images were chosen, statements were drafted, and the royal communications machine went into overdrive to control perception. Headlines celebrated the new prince, the royal baby with American flair, and the continuation of a beloved lineage. Yet beneath the smiling photographs and celebratory announcements, a far more complicated story was quietly unfolding. The first signs of tension came from the very mechanics of record-keeping. As M16 would later reveal in its investigation, there were anomalies in official documents, discrepancies that raised eyebrows among those trained to notice them. Names, birth dates, hospital records, and signatures contained inconsistencies, subtle at first glance, but impossible to ignore for experienced investigators. While these irregularities could be dismissed as clerical errors by an untrained eye, intelligence operatives recognized that patterns rarely emerge from coincidence alone. Archie's birth was followed by Lilibet's, a second child whose arrival continued to draw immense public interest. By this point, Meghan and Harry were acutely aware of the media's capacity to magnify every detail. Their public communications were carefully curated, but in private, concerns about privacy, safety, and control were intensifying. Sources indicate that Meghan became increasingly protective of her children, conscious that the combination of public fascination and institutional scrutiny created an environment where even minor missteps could have serious consequences. Behind closed doors, Meghan's anxiety reportedly grew as she navigated the complex logistics of hospital protocols, royal appearances, and the management of confidential documents. Staff noted that her focus was often split between attending to her newborns, maintaining public composure, and monitoring the dissemination of personal information. The emotional weight of these responsibilities cannot be overstated. Motherhood is challenging under ordinary circumstances, but when combined with global scrutiny and the pressures of royal life, it became a test of resilience and emotional fortitude. Simultaneously, intelligence circles began taking notice of the couple's growing prominence and the increasing volume of personal data flowing into public channels. While much of the media frenzy was predictable, the anomalies in birth records attracted special attention. M16, accustomed to identifying potential security risks and irregularities in documentation, noted inconsistencies that, when taken together, warranted a closer look. Their analysis would later reveal that these discrepancies were not random. They hinted at something far more significant than simple administrative error. What made this situation extraordinary was the intersection of personal privacy and public accountability. The monarchy is, by design, a highly visible institution where lineage, birth, and legitimacy are not just ceremonial, but carry legal and historical significance. The concept of parentage is central to succession, inheritance, and the perception of family integrity. Therefore, any irregularity in official records, even one seemingly minor, could have ramifications far beyond the immediate family, extending to the institution's credibility and the public's trust. Amid this complex landscape, Meghan's personal reactions became increasingly pivotal. Sources suggest that she experienced a mixture of excitement, vigilance, and growing apprehension. The emotional stakes of motherhood were compounded by awareness that every interaction, every document, and every medical record was potentially subject to scrutiny. The stress of balancing joy, public expectation, and procedural oversight created an atmosphere in which panic could easily emerge. Indeed, as later events would show, it was in this delicate intersection of personal vulnerability and institutional pressure that the seeds of crisis were planted. The media played its customary role, amplifying both celebration and speculation. Every photograph of Archie and Lilibet was analyzed for clues, every statement from the palace parsed for nuance, and every minor discrepancy in coverage transformed into conjecture. Public fascination was intense, yet it also functioned as a magnifying glass, intensifying the pressures on Meghan and Harry. Even seemingly benign events, like hospital visits or public appearances with the children, became sites of tension, where privacy was a fleeting commodity and public perception could shift in an instant. In addition to media scrutiny, internal palace dynamics added another layer of complexity. staff and advisors were acutely aware of the stakes, balancing the need for discretion with the imperative of protecting institutional integrity. This required constant vigilance, as even a small leak or misstatement could trigger a cascade of consequences. For Meghan, the result was a heightened sense of responsibility, not just for her children's well-being, but for the narrative surrounding their birth and legitimacy. The combination of personal, familial, and institutional pressures created a climate ripe for anxiety and, eventually, panic. M6's involvement would later reveal just how intertwined these pressures had become. Intelligence operatives meticulously reviewed birth records, cross-referenced data, and identified irregularities that suggested something unusual, if not unprecedented. The anomalies, while initially minor, formed a pattern that could not be ignored. These findings were relayed up the chain of command, and internal briefings emphasized both the sensitivity of the situation and the potential for broader implications. It was a warning sign that the seemingly private details of Archie and Lilibet's births were, in fact, of extraordinary public and institutional significance. The psychological toll on Meghan was palpable. Those close to her noted that she increasingly displayed signs of stress and hypervigilance, anticipating every possible leak, rumor, or misrepresentation. Her instinct to protect her children, combined with the relentless public gaze, created a situation in which even routine actions required careful deliberation. Every photograph, statement, and appearance was weighed for potential consequences, and the emotional strain of this vigilance was compounded by awareness of anomalies in official records, an awareness that would later become central to the panic that gripped her. What is striking about this period is the contrast between public celebration and private concern. On one hand, the births of Archie and Lilibet were joyous, widely celebrated events. On the other hand, they marked the beginning of a chain of events that would expose vulnerabilities in the monarchy's information systems, challenge perceptions of parentage, and create an unprecedented intersection of personal and public scrutiny. The joy of new life was inseparable from the pressure of scrutiny, a tension that would define much of Meghan's subsequent experiences and decisions. As the world admired the family, the quiet work of investigators continued. Every detail of birth records was scrutinized, every signature verified, and every document cross-checked against multiple sources. What initially seemed routine began to reveal a pattern that raised questions about the official narrative. These inquiries, though largely invisible to the public at the time, would later form the backbone of a revelation that shook the monarchy, provoked public debate, and pushed Meghan into what insiders describe as full panic mode. And so, what began as the happiest moments of Meghan and Harry's lives, the births of their children, slowly transformed into a prelude to crisis. The intersection of joy, responsibility, scrutiny, and secrecy created an environment in which even small anomalies could escalate into monumental consequences. It was a delicate balance, and one that neither experience nor preparation could fully mitigate. But what came next would escalate far beyond mere administrative concern, triggering a series of events that would change not only Meghan and Harry's lives, but the very story the public thought it knew about their family. The British intelligence service, M6, operates in the shadows. Known for its discretion, precision, and access to information that the public never sees, it is the kind of organization that rarely makes headlines, and when it does, the details are almost always carefully controlled. But in the case of Meghan Markle and the birth records of Archie and Lilibet, M6 found itself pulled into a story that combined personal, institutional, and international stakes in a way few could have anticipated. At first, the anomalies were small. Subtle inconsistencies in the paperwork surrounding the births, names that appeared slightly altered, signatures that raised minor questions, dates that didn't perfectly align with hospital records. To an outsider, these discrepancies would have seemed trivial, bureaucratic quirks easily explained by clerical oversight. But for intelligence professionals trained to detect patterns, to see through layers of obfuscation, these minor irregularities were flashing red warning signals. The investigation began quietly. Analysts within M6 cross-referenced documents, verified hospital logs, and compared official records with additional data sources that are never publicly disclosed. Every piece of information was treated with extreme caution because the consequences of error could be catastrophic, not just for Meghan and Harry, but for the monarchy itself and for public trust in the integrity of official records. The initial stages of the investigation were meticulous, slow, and methodical. No stone was left unturned. What made this case particularly sensitive was its human element. Unlike typical M16 operations, which often deal with national security threats, espionage, or counterterrorism, this investigation involved individuals whose personal lives were already under intense global scrutiny. Meghan and Harry were public figures in the truest sense, with every action analyzed by media outlets, social media, and countless observers worldwide. Any misstep by the intelligence service could inadvertently spark scandal, leak sensitive information, or damage reputations irreparably. As the investigation deepened, intelligence officers discovered more than they anticipated. Patterns began to emerge. Documentary inconsistencies that, when pieced together, suggested anomalies beyond clerical error. Names and details that appeared correct on the surface revealed subtle irregularities when cross-checked with multiple independent sources. These discrepancies raised a question that no one in the intelligence community asked lightly. Could there be more to the story of Archie and Lilibet's parentage than anyone had publicly acknowledged? Inside M16, discussions were cautious but increasingly urgent. Senior analysts debated the credibility of their findings, the implications for national and institutional security, and the protocols for handling such delicate information. The stakes were unprecedented. They were not dealing with abstract threats, but with a scenario that touched on royal lineage, public trust, and the very perception of the monarchy itself. Even a single leak could trigger a media frenzy, legal ramifications, and diplomatic challenges on a global scale. Meanwhile, within the palace, subtle tensions were already surfacing. Advisors and staff noticed heightened anxiety, particularly from Meghan, whose vigilance and protective instincts intensified as reports filtered back about internal reviews and audits. Her awareness of public perception, combined with a natural instinct to safeguard her family, created a sense of mounting pressure. Sources suggest that she began questioning the security of information, the integrity of documentation, and the potential consequences of even minor disclosures. Panic, at first manageable, began to take hold. The process of investigation was painstaking. M16 analysts examined every facet of the birth records, hospital logs, doctor signatures, medical reports, and registration documents. They compared each against independent verification sources, tracking every anomaly, no matter how small. What they discovered was astonishing. Not a single glaring error, but a constellation of discrepancies that, when viewed collectively, defied simple explanation. These anomalies were subtle enough to be invisible to the casual observer, yet consistent enough to suggest a pattern that demanded further scrutiny. For Meghan, the psychological impact was profound. Insiders indicate that she began exhibiting behaviors indicative of heightened anxiety. Repeated checks, meticulous oversight of documents, and constant concern about who had access to sensitive information. Her maternal instincts, already intensified by the responsibilities of raising two young children, were now coupled with a deep-seated fear that private aspects of her family life could be exposed, scrutinized, or misrepresented. The combination of personal concern and institutional investigation created a pressure cooker of stress and vigilance. What makes this chapter of the story so compelling is the convergence of two worlds: the intensely private sphere of motherhood and the highly public, meticulously controlled environment of intelligence oversight. Normally, these domains never intersect so directly. Yet here, the personal and institutional were entwined in a way that magnified both risk and consequence. Intelligence professionals were scrutinizing every detail for anomalies, while Meghan, unaware of the full scope of their findings, was navigating her own private anxieties in response to both public perception and the emerging internal pressures. The investigation also revealed contradictions that deepened the mystery. Certain details appeared in one record but not another. Dates conflicted subtly. Signatures seemed inconsistent with standard procedures. Each anomaly could have a mundane explanation, Yet the accumulation of inconsistencies formed a mosaic too complex to ignore. Analysts began to speculate cautiously about potential causes, but the ultimate questions they faced were both sensitive and explosive. What did these anomalies mean, and what were the implications for the couple and their children? At the same time, M6's involvement introduced an element of secrecy that heightened tension. Unlike journalists or public commentators, intelligence operatives could access information far beyond what the media could uncover. Their findings, though confidential, had the potential to be far more damning than anything circulating publicly. For Meghan and Harry, this created a new kind of vulnerability, an invisible force watching and analyzing, capable of exposing truths that no one outside the highest echelons of power could even imagine. The situation reached a tipping point when preliminary analyses suggested that the anomalies were neither random nor minor. The data patterns indicated irregularities that touched on the very legitimacy of public records, anomalies that hinted at questions about parentage and documentation. The intelligence community recognized that while these findings were not publicly known, they could have extraordinary consequences if ever disclosed. For Meghan, the emergence of these findings, even in the background, intensified a growing sense of panic. It is important to recognize that M6 did not act recklessly. Every step was measured, every investigation deliberate. Analysts understood the human impact of their work, particularly on public figures whose lives were already under scrutiny. Yet, despite their caution, the very act of uncovering anomalies created a pressure that radiated outward, affecting the behavior, decisions, and emotional state of Meghan Markle. She was aware, intuitively or otherwise, that forces beyond her control were now evaluating aspects of her life that she had assumed were private. And so, the stage was set for the next phase of the story, the discovery of hidden truths within birth records. The careful, methodical work of M6 had revealed patterns, discrepancies, and questions that demanded answers. For Meghan, these findings would mark the beginning of a descent into full panic mode, a state of heightened vigilance, emotional intensity, and protective behavior that would define much of the narrative that followed. But what came next would pierce the veil of secrecy, transforming subtle anomalies into explosive revelations that neither the palace nor the public could ignore. Official birth records are meant to be unambiguous, authoritative, and final. They are documents that establish identity, parentage, and legal standing. Yet, in the case of Archie and Lilibet, what should have been a straightforward reflection of birth and family ties began to reveal something far more complex, far more troubling, and far more consequential than anyone had anticipated. What M6 uncovered in these documents would go on to challenge not only public perception but also deeply held assumptions about legitimacy, identity, and the private realities of one of the world's most scrutinized families. At first glance, the records appeared ordinary. Names, dates, hospital information, everything seemingly in order. But the intelligence investigation, precise and meticulous, uncovered small anomalies. Minor inconsistencies in dates, subtle variations in signatures, and discrepancies in official entries that, when viewed collectively, created a puzzle impossible to ignore. Each anomaly in isolation could be dismissed as clerical oversight, but the cumulative effect suggested a deliberate or at least highly unusual pattern. The anomalies were subtle but significant. For example, certain hospital records contained conflicting details about delivery procedures, while registration forms listed signatures that differed from those in medical logs. Even more striking were the variations in parental details. Documents that were assumed to be standard legal records were, upon scrutiny, inconsistent in ways that raised questions about who had verified them, who had signed them, and, most importantly, the underlying accuracy of what they purported to represent. The investigation revealed another layer of irregularity, temporal inconsistencies. Some entries suggested overlapping timelines or documentation completed before procedures that should have preceded them. While an ordinary observer might assume this was clerical error, intelligence analysts recognized patterns that indicated a more systemic discrepancy. Each inconsistency, each minor error, when cross-referenced against independent sources, became a piece of a larger, more troubling mosaic. M. SIX's findings were treated with extreme caution. Analysts understood the explosive potential of their discoveries. Unlike a conventional scandal or rumor, these anomalies touched on official documentation, legal legitimacy, and the possibility of misrepresented parentage. The implications were profound. Not only did the investigation reveal irregularities, it hinted at questions that had never been publicly asked, questions about the very identity of the children and, by extension, the Duchess of Sussex herself. Behind the palace walls, the impact on Meghan was already evident. Sources suggest that she became hyper-vigilant about the handling of documents, hospital protocols, and who had access to private records. Her protective instincts, amplified by the stakes involved, turned into a kind of internal panic. Staff members described a new level of caution in her interactions, a heightened awareness that every document, every conversation, and every decision could be scrutinized, both internally and externally. The pressure was relentless. The intelligence investigation also brought new tensions between private life and public narrative into sharp focus. Publicly, Meghan was celebrated as a devoted mother, a modern duchess, and a global figure of poise and influence. Privately, the anomalies in official records introduced uncertainty and fear. It is one thing to manage media scrutiny or public criticism. It is another to confront potential challenges to legitimacy that, if revealed, could provoke legal, social, and institutional crises. Moreover, these findings highlighted a larger tension within royal life. The intersection of tradition and modernity. The monarchy relies on centuries-old protocols, meticulous record-keeping, and the public's faith in the integrity of its processes. Any question about birth records, however minor, carries outsized weight. In Meghan's case, the intelligence investigation suggested that ordinary expectations of privacy and administrative accuracy were insufficient safeguards. The anomalies were not simply procedural. They had the potential to destabilize public confidence and provoke unprecedented scrutiny. M6's analysts also noted patterns that suggested coordination, whether intentional or inadvertent, in how the records were maintained. Certain details appeared standardized in ways that diverged from typical bureaucratic practice, raising questions about who was responsible for the entries and why they had been made in such a manner. Each question led to more questions, compounding the sense of uncertainty and making the investigation increasingly urgent. For Meghan, the consequences of these findings were immediate and visceral. Sources describe her as entering full panic mode, reviewing documents obsessively, questioning staff, and seeking assurance that her family's integrity and safety were protected. The usual pressures of public life now intersected with a private, existential concern. One that made every interaction, every record, and every communication a potential flashpoint. Her heightened vigilance reflected a very human response to an extraordinary situation, the instinct to protect her children, her identity, and her reputation in the face of forces beyond her control. Meanwhile, the potential implications of the anomalies extended beyond personal anxiety. Within the palace, advisors and legal teams began to assess the risks posed by the investigation's findings. Discussions were cautious but urgent. What would happen if these discrepancies became public? How could the family, the institution, and the monarchy respond without exacerbating the situation? The stakes were high. Reputations, public trust, and the careful balance of power within the royal family were all potentially at risk. The deeper M6 delved into the records, the clearer it became that these anomalies were not isolated incidents. They formed a pattern, one that demanded explanation and, eventually, disclosure to senior authorities. The intelligence team understood that what they were uncovering could not remain contained forever. The pattern of irregularities was such that someone would inevitably notice, question, and seek clarification, and when that moment arrived, the stakes would be monumental. For Meghan, the psychological weight was compounded by the realization that she had little control over the investigation. Unlike public appearances, interviews, or media narratives, these documents were beyond her influence. She could not edit, manage, or spin the findings. They existed independently, verified by trained professionals operating within a framework of discretion and authority. This lack of control intensified anxiety, driving her behavior toward heightened vigilance and, ultimately, panic. As the investigation progressed, the intelligence findings began to converge on a chilling possibility. The documents suggested questions about biological maternity, the very foundation of what the public assumed about Meghan. Her identity as a mother and the legitimacy of Archie and Lilibet was now in question, though at this stage, the full implications had not yet been revealed. For those monitoring the situation, the potential fallout was extraordinary. Questions of parentage, identity, and institutional credibility were not theoretical. They were immediate, real, and capable of triggering profound consequences. And yet, even with these revelations, the story was far from complete. The anomalies in the birth records, the emerging patterns, and the potential questions about parentage were only the beginning. The next steps in the investigation, the responses of the palace, and Meghan's reactions would transform what started as subtle discrepancies into a full-blown crisis of unprecedented magnitude. But what came next would strip away any illusion of control and force Meghan to confront realities she had never imagined, realities that would push her into full panic mode and set the stage for revelations that would shock the world. Panic is a peculiar thing. It starts subtly, a flutter of unease, a flicker of worry, but in certain circumstances, it can grow into an all-consuming force, shaping thoughts, decisions, and behavior. For Meghan Markle, the discovery of anomalies in Archie and Lilibet's birth records, coupled with the relentless scrutiny of M16's investigation, became exactly that kind of pressure. What began as concern over minor discrepancies escalated into a pervasive sense of fear, urgency, and near-constant hypervigilance. Sources close to the Duchess described the early stages of her panic as almost imperceptible. Small behaviors began to change. Repeated verification of documents, questioning staff about minor details, and an increased insistence on controlling access to sensitive information. On the surface, these actions appeared rational, protective, even prudent, but in the context of escalating intelligence scrutiny, they marked the beginning of a profound psychological response. Meghan's mind, accustomed to navigating complex public and media environments, had now turned inward, focusing on the possibility that her private world could be exposed in ways that were both personal and catastrophic. The intensity of the panic intensified as M16's investigation deepened. Each new finding, each cross-reference document, each internal verification became a source of stress. Meghan reportedly felt cornered. Not by public opinion, but by forces operating in shadows, with access to information she could not influence or control. This sense of helplessness, combined with the stakes involving her children, family legacy, and public image, amplified anxiety into near-constant vigilance. The emotional strain was extraordinary, reflecting the human reaction to an unprecedented convergence of private vulnerability and institutional scrutiny. Staff and palace insiders began to notice behavioral shifts. Meghan, usually composed and strategic, displayed signs of heightened alertness and emotional intensity. Meetings that were once routine now required careful preparation, with questions anticipated and contingency plans formulated for every possible scenario. Even casual interactions were approached with caution, as she sought to maintain control over information flow and minimize exposure. The meticulousness of these behaviors was remarkable, but also a clear signal that panic was shaping her decisions and daily routines. One of the most profound effects of this panic was its influence on Meghan's perception of risk. The anomalies in the birth records were not mere administrative errors. They had become, in her mind, potential triggers for public scandal, legal challenges, and institutional confrontation. Every document, every signature, every detail was scrutinized with a level of intensity that bordered on obsession. Sources describe instances where Meghan would personally review paperwork multiple times, cross-checking details that might seem trivial to most but were critical in her assessment of potential threats. Simultaneously, her protective instincts toward Archie and Lilibet intensified dramatically. Motherhood under normal circumstances is demanding. Motherhood under global scrutiny, with questions surrounding legitimacy and private records, is an entirely different reality. Meghan's panic was intertwined with maternal concern. fear for the safety, well-being, and public perception of her children. Every decision, from the selection of caregivers to the management of public appearances, was influenced by a heightened sense of urgency and a need to shield her children from both scrutiny and potential institutional intrusion. The psychological impact of this constant vigilance was compounded by external pressures. Media speculation, public commentary, and social media discourse acted as an omnipresent backdrop, magnifying every misstep or perceived misalignment. Meghan, acutely aware of how narratives could spiral, responded by tightening control over communication, curating appearances with extreme precision, and managing access to sensitive information with extraordinary care. These behaviors, while logical under the circumstances, reinforced the cycle of anxiety and contributed to an escalating sense of panic. Furthermore, the involvement of intelligence agencies added a dimension of invisibility and uncertainty. Unlike media scrutiny, which can be anticipated and managed to some degree, M16 operated without public notice. Its analysis, verification, and internal briefings were entirely outside Meghan's control. The knowledge, or even the suspicion, that powerful actors were reviewing personal and family information without transparency created a psychological burden that intensified fear and hypervigilance. Every decision became a potential risk, every interaction a potential leak, every document a potential exposure. Sources indicate that the panic reached a peak during moments when sensitive information about the children's birth records was under discussion or review. Meghan's responses reportedly included both hyper-control of her immediate environment and strategic efforts to influence outcomes, whether through legal counsel, palace staff, or personal interventions. Her actions reflected a deep understanding of the stakes, but also the natural human response to perceived threats when control is limited and consequences are extreme. What is particularly striking about this phase of Meghan's experience is the interplay of personal emotion and institutional pressure. Panic was not merely an individual psychological response. It was a force shaped by the convergence of identity, motherhood, public expectation, and unseen intelligence scrutiny. The anomalies in the birth records, coupled with the intelligence findings, created a situation in which even routine actions could carry extraordinary implications. The stakes were no longer hypothetical. They were immediate, personal, and potentially transformative. At the same time, the crisis revealed the human dimensions of Meghan's resilience. Despite the intensity of panic, she continued to navigate public appearances, media engagements, and family responsibilities with remarkable composure. The duality of her experience, external calm masking internal turmoil, underscored the extraordinary psychological strain imposed by the convergence of public scrutiny, intelligence investigation, and personal stakes.